Hello, I'm Catherine Harris. Today's date is Monday, June 21st, 2010. I'm here in Beverly Hills, California to interview Sidney Sheinberg for the Archive of American Television.
Great.
Mr. Sheinberg, what was your name at birth?
My name at birth was Sid Sheinberg, just like it is today.
Not Sidney J?
Well, I guess my mother would call me Sidney J.
And spelled out J-A-Y.
Spelled out J-A-Y.
And when were you born?
I was born January 14th, 1935.
Where?
Sorry?
Where were you born?
I was born in Corpus Christi, Texas.
And your father's name was?
My father's name was Harry, H-A-R-R-Y.
And what did he do?
He was a merchant. They had a department store in Corpus Christi, which was a very small town at that time.
And your mother?
My mother was, other than being a partner of his, was essentially a housekeeper and mother.
And her name was?
Her name was Tillie, T-I-L-L-I-E.
And both came from Eastern Europe, as I recall.
Well, my father came from an area that was usually Poland, sometimes Russia, and sometimes someplace else. I really never understood exactly where on a map it was. And my mother came from Odessa.
But your father came by way of Rio, didn't he?
My father got a job, you're close, not Rio, but Buenos Aires. When he was very young, I don't know exactly what age, but somewhere around 12 or 14 or something like that, he got on a boat, and the reason he went to Rio was that the boat was going to Rio. And the people who were recruiting for employees were recruiting for the Buenos Aires meat packing industry. And since he was very strong and could tolerate cold temperatures, he was one of those people selected, and he probably wasn't totally honest about his age, but that's how he ended up in Buenos Aires.
What traits do you think you inherited from your parents?
That's a very hard question to answer. I probably rebelled against their traits in as much as I inherited their traits. I don't know what traits I inherited from my parents.
Which single trait did you rebel against most?
Oh, I would say behaving in a older-fashioned, traditional, safe, overly safe way. I mean, they were people who lived their lives in fear. Mm-hmm. And it's very understandable if you had to escape from your country where there were various and sundry groups that would roll into town and do damage to the Jewish people there. And I've tried to live my life not in fear. And I would say that on the spur of the moment, if I thought about this for a while, I'd probably give you a different answer. But the reflexive answer would be, I think their fear is probably the trait that I rebelled against.
And you have one sibling, correct?
I have a sister,
mm-hmm.
One.
One, younger, older?
Younger sister who was named after an actress of ancient times by the name of Alice Faye.
Gosh, I didn't know that. But she's not in the entertainment business at all.
She is not in the entertainment business. She's a graduate of Stanford, went to Barnard for 1 year, and her longtime partner died a couple of years ago. He was a doctor who practiced orthomolecular medicine, which no one who sees this will know what that means. He was originally a Stanford graduate with a specialty in hip surgery, but he spent a great deal of his life working with Linus Pauling and was an incredible believer in these types of medications. Vitamin C was their god, and he died, and she's never been short of boyfriends, so she's got a boyfriend now, at least one. Might need an extra one for spare one day. So,
well, back in Corpus Christi, what activities interested you when you were growing up? Did you play a musical instrument? Did you act in plays? Did you work for your father?
A musical instrument I did not play. I took violin when I was about 6 or 7 years old, and it hated me. I was very bad. I did do a lot of things involving declamations, debates, plays.
So you did do some acting on stage.
I did do some acting on stage. As a matter of fact, in a minor way, I even toured in a play.
Regionally or locally, or?
It was kind of regional. It was one of those things where you put on a performance, got on the bus, probably didn't get a seat even though you were one of the main stars of this play, and stood up till the next town where you did the next play.
So was it little theater, or?
No, this was one play. It was a play called A Flag is Born. Now, you should know all about that, but on the assumption you don't, it was a play written by Ben Hecht, and it was performed at the inception of the State of Israel. I spent a considerable amount of my youth with an organization called Young Judea, which was a kind of a Zionist youth organization.
And during that period, though, did you have to work for your dad after school, or?
I worked for my dad also, and I don't know what there is to say about that. I was a good salesman.
There you go. And which high school did you attend?
I attended a high school called W.B. Ray.
R-A-Y.
R-A-Y, and I have no clue as we sit here now who W.B. Ray is.
How did you compress 4 years of high school into 3?
Well, I guess the same way I compressed 4 years of college into 3. My parents were always after me to perform better than I was performing. And I was brought up, if I got straight A's, why didn't I get straight A pluses? And if you can graduate in 3 years, why wouldn't you graduate in 3 years? I don't know, truthfully, what the rush was all about. But I did, and as a result, I got a little bit ahead of myself, probably.
And yet, during high school...
Just to interrupt you for a moment, I was asked to make a speech a couple of weeks ago at Columbia, which I did, and I made it with the 55th reunion of the class of 55 of Columbia College. And the odd thing about it is that I didn't hardly know anybody in the class, because my real class that I started with was
56.
the class of 56. And I think it's a bad idea to accelerate. That's part of the wisdom to be portrayed by this important piece of tape.
Good. But during high school, you worked at 3 different radio stations?
If you say so, I'm going to believe you, because I only remember 2. I worked at a station called KSIX, which was an ABC affiliate, and I worked at a station called KWBU, which was owned by the Southern Baptist Convention, who loved me.
But how did you have time for that if you were pushing through school in 3 years?
I don't think that was a real problem. I genuinely don't believe that kids worked as hard those days as they do today.
So this was after school or on weekends or in the summers?
Yes, this was after school, on weekends in the summers. I made a great deal of money for a kid. I not only was an announcer, but I could do bilingual announcing. I could, at that time, tear off some AP copy, which for the uninformed used to come just like you see in the old movies. Cut, 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 cut. And I could read it and simultaneously translate into Spanish.
Can you still do that?
I can't do anything of the sort. I also wrote advertising copy, and
Did you write continuity?
well, I didn't write continuity because there really wasn't the continuity that appeared. I did extemporaneously. I was also a disc jockey. You have to understand that in those days you didn't have format radio. You had radio that covered various things. It started off with the morning show, which was aimed at basically farmers, and it had everything from country music to the price of certain farm commodities, which I did. And KSIX was a network station, so they had network feeds of news and stuff of that sort. Some of the people, believe it or not, are still around or were still around. I remember Martin Agronsky. I don't know if he's still alive, but he was alive until relatively recently, if he's not alive. I can't believe he's still alive. And
he was on the ABC?
He was on ABC. And of course, working for an independent station was a whole other experience. But most of the things that would have been written were done ad lib. And some of the stuff was quite primitive. I remember doing a remote of a high school football game or something, and we somehow or other were not in telephone connection with the station. And we really didn't know whether we were on the air during the entire broadcast. And we went back to the station, and everybody said, "Great, great job." I said, "We were on the air?" They said, "Yeah, everything was perfect." What do you mean we were on? Were we on the air? And they said, "Well, you know, we cued you and you went right on." I said, "Well, we were using our watches. We couldn't hear you at all." That was a bizarre experience.
But you didn't continue any disc jockey work once you got to college, right?
Once I got to Columbia, I didn't. I thought about it, but I took a rather substantial, I took 25 units, I believe, during my first year at Columbia. and the average was 15.
And they let you.
They let me?
Yeah.
I don't think at Columbia they would stop you from jumping off the building.
Well, you said, let's back up. You've said on several occasions that you'd never been north of the Mason-Dixon line before college. Is that correct?
Yes. Now I'm assuming for the purposes of that conversation, this is going to belie or betray my total ignorance of geography, but I'm presuming that North Carolina.
Wrong.
Was North Carolina north of the Mason-Dixon line?
No.
Well, then I'm right.
Okay.
I had been to North Carolina. That was the furthest north I'd ever been.
Safe. Who or what influenced your decision to apply to Yale and Columbia?
Well, I had a very good friend by the name of Ed Levy, and oddly enough, his father worked for the station that I worked for, and Ed kind of got me involved in radio to a degree because the way I started in radio was we had a high school radio show that he and I wrote, directed, produced, etc., on Saturday morning. And the station management, even though I have a totally defective memory, I remember the guy's name. His name was Gene Looper. I can tell you a story about him if it's relevant, but they were very taken with our show. You know, we had a theme song, the high school fight song, and they offered me a job. Actually, the offer that they made me was nearly the same as the offer that MCA made me like 7 or 8 years later after I was a college graduate, a law school graduate, a lawyer.
It happens. But your friend influenced you about your...
My friend Ed Levy, we used to sit in the car at night overlooking the water, and we talked about this magical time and place that was about to happen to us. We were going to go to college. And he had an incredible snobbery, probably not without going to Pennsylvania. And I applied to Yale, I guess. I don't remember applying to Yale, but I must have applied to Yale. If not, I couldn't have been accepted, could I?
Usually not.
I was conditionally accepted on the basis of the fact that I would take and pass 2 classes in science and math that I did not have. And I took those at a junior college in...
That was Del Mar College, I think.
That was Del Mar College. Nonetheless, I decided to go to Columbia, and I think one of the main reasons I decided to go to Columbia was I had a cousin there who is still there, a fellow by the name of Jeff Milam, and Jeff lived in the village, and I went east rather early, and it was the fact that I just loved New York. I mean, it was just a magical kind of place for me. Later on in my professional career, I was involved in the development of a couple of movies and television series which were fantasy versions of my New York existence.
Can you name one or two of those?
I can name both of them. One of them was called Coogan's Bluff, which starred Clint Eastwood And at the height of arrogance, it is the height of arrogance to say that that is a fantasy version of my coming to New York, but it's true. And the other one was a show that was kind of stolen by us from ourselves called McCloud. And my former friend Dennis Weaver played a character from Taos, if that's the way you pronounced it. That's the way he pronounced it. New Mexico. New Mexico? Taos, New Mexico. And he was on loan to the New York Police Department in the series. It was really a terrific semi-comedy series.
Putting a Westerner in New York.
Putting a Westerner in New York. The difference between it and
Coogan's Bluff.
Coogan's Bluff was it was a little more humorous, a little bit lighter.
And at what point, well, you know, at Columbia, were you a campus leader? You were taking all those hours, but...
Well, I don't know what a campus leader really was. I reformed. I was one of the people. I shouldn't, you know, this I. It sounds egomaniacal, but I was one of the people that reformed a college fraternity.
Sigma Alpha Mu.
Sigma Alpha Mu. Why don't I just leave and you sit here and you'll answer the questions? You'll do a better job. Yes, we reformed this fraternity and did some really silly things during that period.
So you had some fun.
Yes, knavish things. Actually, that was really an important element to me in my first year. I'll tell you a little anecdote about my first year in Columbia. One of the guys who got me involved in forming this fraternity was a young guy, slightly weird, by the name of Ron Capon. And without making too many jokes about the name, I asked him once if he had anybody to recommend that I ought to call up, you know, for a date. And he gave me the name of a young woman, and he said, you ought to call her up. She's a real friend of mine, and so on and so forth, which I don't know how true that was, but she was the first girl that I called. And she was still in high school. She went to a school called something like the High School for Performing Arts, which was kind of a big deal in New York. It was a public high school, but for people who were interested in that line of work. And we had a date, and I came to pick her up at her apartment. She lived on the Upper West Side, which was pretty convenient. And I quickly learned at Columbia you didn't ask girls out who lived in faraway Brooklyn. Easier to ask girls out who lived in Texas. We went down to the street, and I started walking toward 92nd Street, because 92nd Street, I believe it's 92nd Street, that had a local subway stop. It's either 92nd or 96th, one of the two. And she said, what are you doing? I said, I'm going to the subway station. She said, I don't ride subways. I only ride cabs. The girl's name was Suzanne Plachette, and we knew each other till her recent demise. And I always kidded her about that.
So you knew her before she knew Lou Wasserman.
I knew her before she knew anybody other than her parents. I mean, she was 16 years old.
That's a great story.
And never changed. The version of Suzanne Plachette, including some of the stories that were told about her ballsiness, were true at age 16, just like they were true at age 60.
Well, how did you meet Lorraine Gary?
Lorraine Gary, that's a familiar name. Where do I know that name from? Oh, my wife. A friend of mine, this is my version of the story. My wife has another version of the story, which to me, I don't even think has any validity, but I want to make it clear it's my version. I had a friend by the name of Al Miller. He's still alive to the best of my knowledge and a very unusual guy. He has never gone for a single year without taking a course at Columbia. Courses in every subject imaginable. First, he got a business degree after graduating from college. Columbia, as you may know, did not take kindly to your specializing in anything.
As an undergraduate.
As an undergraduate. It was strictly a liberal arts. You know, if you studied Plato and Herodotus, that was enough. Anyhow, he later became a doctor, and he invited me once to join him in inviting or going out on a double date. I don't remember too much about it, but there was a hurricane in New York, which is kind of rare for New York. And I met this girl from Beverly Hills by the name of Lorraine Gottfried. And the word Gary is a professional name that she took from the name of her class's permanent president. She was the permanent secretary, and he was the president, and his name was Norman Gary, who tragically committed suicide a number of years ago.
He was the Fox attorney.
He was what?
He was an attorney for 20th Century Fox?
No, he may have represented Fox, but he was an attorney who represented a number of important Hollywood. I'm unaware, but if you say it, I'm inclined to believe it, but I don't remember it.
But they were classmates at Beverly Hills High School?
They were classmates at Beverly Hills High School.
Great. So you met on a double date?
Met on this double date, and
was she also studying at Columbia?
She was going to what was called the School of Dramatic Arts. Columbia had no women in the undergraduate school. There was this place called Barnard where a bunch of unattractive women resided. But
and it didn't have the School of General Studies in those days?
It did have the School of General Studies, but the School of General Studies, which granted a Bachelor of Science degree, was more like, I think at UCLA they called extension. It was really not designed as a day exclusive school, but was really designed for students who worked or students who couldn't go full time. The dean of the School of Dramatic Arts was a gentleman by the name of John Hausman. And I rescued her from, at least temporarily, from dramatic arts and got her into political science and things like that.
Did she study at Columbia at that point, or?
She studied at Columbia, and then later, when I graduated and applied to law school, she was behind me. And we both ended up going to the University of Texas as a result of my thinking at that time that I probably would go back to Texas. But I was a little bit ahead of the civil rights movement and ended up getting into a fight with the University of Texas Law School. She was with me in Texas, and I quit and applied to Columbia. And in those days, it was nearly impossible to get into a school like the Columbia Law School as a transfer student. But I did get in. I was one of two people. The other one still teaches there. I haven't seen him in 50 years. And Lorraine went to, Lorraine ended up going to the School of General Studies and graduating from there.
Which was co-ed.
Which was co-ed.
Yeah.
And the School of Columbia College now is not only co-ed, there are more women than men. It's gone to the dogs.
Just briefly, I wanted to touch on the civil rights issue because I'm thinking that Corpus Christi public schools were still segregated when you were growing up, racially segregated. And you came back to Texas in 1955, right, to go to law school.
Right.
They had already admitted their first handful of African American students.
Right.
And the issue was the student body had elected a young woman.
There was an annual event at the University of Texas that was called the Roundup, and Roundup equaled homecoming. And every school elected its queen, and in those days the queens were female. As a result of this election, a black woman was selected the Portia, which was the name of the queen of the law school. And she was a very accomplished black woman. I don't remember what school she had gone to, but she'd gone to a prestigious Eastern private school, Smith or Vassar or Radcliffe or one of those, that ilk. And as a result of this election, the dean of the law school persuaded her that it would be in the best interest of the law school if she really declined. And she was pressured to decline. I didn't even know her. I mean,
but you were deeply offended.
I was outraged by it.
And how do you think you came by these strong feelings, having grown up in the segregated South?
I always had these strong feelings. I don't know whether or not it had something to do with being a minority. Mm-hmm. I don't really think it did, because I was not, on too many occasions, discriminated against. There were some occasions, but not too many. Mostly social discrimination. But in any event, I was outraged. Lorraine and I were kind of arrested during our honeymoon in New Orleans, which is another story. But to go back to the main A-line story, I quit and Lorraine quit, and I was readmitted to Columbia Law School. There's a kind of irony to the whole thing, in the sense that I was originally admitted to Harvard Law School before I went to Texas. And because Lorraine had studied in the School of Dramatic Arts, she couldn't get in to one of the better Eastern schools because they didn't consider those credits, even from Columbia, to be worthy of their acceptance. As a result of which, at the last minute, on the way to the airport, being driven by my father, I changed my mind and decided not to go to Harvard because I didn't want to get separated from Lorraine, and to go to Texas. I hope this story sounds coherent.
Sounds like love.
So that's how we ended up at Texas, and then after this fight with the University of Texas, the dean turned to me and he said, maybe you can't go home again, young man. And I said, maybe I can't. And he said, let me call my brother and get you into Harvard. And I said, well, there'd be an irony to that because I was admitted without your phone call, and I chose to come here. As a result of this experience, I didn't go back to Austin for, I don't know, 20 years maybe or something, from 1956 to the year we released The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas. And when I went there, it was quite a big event. Premiere, big barbecue, and I was seated next to Her Honor, the mayor of the city of Austin. And she said, Mr. Sheinberg, as you know, we made some of your colleagues, I don't know whether they were made honorary Texans or members, admirals of the Texas Navy or something equally ludicrous. But she said, I understand that we couldn't make you an honorary Texan because you are a Texan. I said, yes, that's true. She says, and I understand you actually went to the law school here for a while. I said, that's also true. She says, possibly you knew my father, Page Keaton. And I kind of bit my tongue and said, this is one of those moments in life when you either ruin the evening and tell the truth or shut up. And I decided to shut up. But with that exception, I didn't go back to Austin for God knows how many years. One day I was given an honor by the School of Communications, which is quite a big deal. And I went back for that at the urging of Robert Strauss, who was on our board at MCA and a professional Texan. And up until about a year or two ago, I was asked to make a speech at the University of Texas. And I went back. That was like my second trip. And the Austin of today bears no resemblance to the Austin of none. I mean, there's as much bias in Los Angeles, probably more so than there is in Austin. And it's amazing. I mean, it's a blue city in a red state. And I look forward toward the day when Texas becomes a blue state.
There you go. Well, I believe you once told me that you were interested in law from an early age, as well as entertainment, or the kinds of work you did at the radio station. I mean, you were pretty determined to go on to law school, even when you were in college, right? What did you major in at college?
You didn't major in
at Columbia?
At Columbia, the word major didn't exist.
Okay.
What you did is you acquired maturity points. And maturity points at that time were classes of a level of difficulty as distinguished from lower level, but you didn't major. In other words, there was no pre-law program or English history program.
When you finished law at Columbia, did you teach at Columbia briefly?
No, I taught at UCLA.
I had read that you actually taught at Columbia first, and I was unaware of that. So,
No, I taught at. There's a kind of amusing story and connected to that also. Once I got to Columbia as a transfer student, I found that I was ineligible for the law review because even though Columbia accepted the credits from the University of Texas, they didn't accept the grades. So, ergo, you couldn't transfer in and be on the law review. This irritated me also.
but you were also recognized as a scholar there. There were some named scholarships, correct?
Well,
Yeah.
let me finish my first point. I decided that to get even with Columbia, because by that time I'd gotten mad at them as well as at Texas, what I would do was write an article and try to get it published in a law review. I don't know how things are today, but in those days, that would be pretty much impossible. It would be like a writer of a small town paper getting front page a story in the New York Times, Sunday edition. So I wrote this story. I wrote this article at Columbia, and I sent it. I don't remember how many places I sent it, not too many, but one of the places I sent it was to UCLA. And I got a call from the dean, or maybe he wasn't the dean yet. I think he was kind of the dean-elect, a guy by the name of Dick Maxwell. And he said, "We'd like to publish this." And I said, "Really?" Excuse me. I didn't really expect it to be published, but they did publish it. And if you look in the source materials, you'll find that there in that issue of the UCLA Law Review is this article.
And that's how you first came to UCLA's attention.
That's true. It is true. I ended up being offered a job. I don't know if we got to that part yet, but I was offered a job as a associate, which was probably the lowest paying legal teaching job on earth, which I took. It was quite convenient because it allowed me to move back here where my wife lived and study for the bar. I had one distinction. I took the bar exam having had fewer of the courses on which I was examined than anybody that had taken the bar exam to that date. And I passed it my first try. And the California bar was a scary thing. The rate of passage was not all that high. I don't know, something like 50% or give or take a couple of points. And the better law school you went to, the lesser likelihood of your passing it, it seemed. There was a story, I don't know if it's true or not, about how the editor-in-chief of the Harvard Law Review had once taken it and failed it the first time. As I say, I don't know if that story is true or just mythical, but...
Well, when you took the job at UCLA, what did you teach? What kind of law?
I taught two different types of thing. One, I taught a course in legal research and writing, 5 sections, and which is a lot. It shouldn't be, but it's considered a lot. And the second thing I did was I taught a course in the legal profession. And that was even sillier in some ways, because it would seem to me that the one thing you wouldn't want a young guy who's never really practiced law to teach is this course in the legal profession. And it was, to some degree, a course in legal ethics and legal practice and that kind of thing.
But you didn't plan your career around teaching. This was a one-year post?
This was a one-year appointment, but I liked it. I liked teaching. And I think if it had been the kind of thing where I could have stayed at UCLA and not had to move, I probably would have done it. But that's not the way it worked in those days. You had to go from UCLA to Minnesota or someplace cold and unpleasant, and then you'd write some articles, and it took a long time before you got to Columbia or Harvard or Texas, because Texas, notwithstanding my political civil rights issue with the dean, Texas was, and to the best of my knowledge, remains a very good law school.
Well, you were teaching at UCLA in December of '58 when MCA purchased the real estate and sound stages of Universal City. Did you notice? Did it whet your appetite?
I don't remember.
So what prompted you to move to Review?
Well, first of all, as you implied earlier, the job at UCLA was not intended to be a permanent job. It was intended for a one-year appointment and to allow me to study for the bar. My wife's father was a business manager.
And his name was?
His name was George Gottfried, and he was a CPA, and he represented a large number of talented people who were then big deals primarily in the music industry. He represented a guy by the name of Johnny Ray, if you remember that name. He represented Chazelle McKenzie, who was a Canadian artist who had been quite successful here. He represented Frankie Lane, Mule Drain, and many of the clients that he represented were also represented by MCA. And he heard somehow, I don't even remember how, from the senior attorney of MCA, a guy by the name of Jack Finlater, that the studio, namely Review Productions, MCA had been given a waiver to not only exist in the agency business, but also to conduct business in the television business under the theory that that would promote employment. And the president of the Screen Actors Guild at that time was a fellow by the name of Ronald Reagan. Anyhow, as a result of my father-in-law's cause and introduction to take place, I ended up talking to the people at Review. I never talked to the people at MCA Artists, which was the agency. As I say, this negotiation, which was over whether I'd get paid $90 or $100 or $125 a week, lasted for months. And it raised certain questions that were to haunt me afterward. because there really was no structure at Review Productions. For the record, Review is R-E-V-U-E, and I don't know why it's called Review, but that's what it was called. The thing finally got resolved. I finally did get $125 a week.
Which I believe you said was less than you've been earning at UCLA.
It really was, because although I was earning probably less at UCLA, you only worked 9 months because you had the summer. So if you amortized the salary, it was less.
And who actually offered?
Any way you look at it, it was not a fortune.
Who offered you the job?
At UCLA?
No, at Review. Was it Jack or was it Al Dorskin?
Well, that's not as simple a question to answer as meets the eye. Jack Finlater certainly was a supporter and was the front man because he was the general counsel to the parent company. Al Dorskin was kind of the chief operating officer of Review, and that whole place was the hornet's nest over there. There was another fellow there who was kind of in charge of the law department. His name was Jim Weinberg, and there was another fellow there who was brought in, and an orderly structure of a pyramidal sort or some other business organization type, Review wasn't. I mean, with all deference to my lifelong colleague and dear friend Lou Wasserman, everybody would agree that he was the boss, but beyond that, there was plenty of room for confusion.
Well, what were your duties and who did you report to?
I reported to Jim Weinberg, who was head of the law department. I was the number 7 man in a 7-man law department. And I started off with very menial kind of duties, sending notices, exercising options, negotiating simple contracts. Most complicated thing I ended up having to do was they were contemplating making a series on an American in Paris. I think it was An American in Paris, but it had to do with music rights. And I learned how little I knew about music rights. And I've always been afraid since then of getting involved in something that involves music rights, because it follows no pattern, and you better know what you're doing or you're going to do something wrong.
Well, MCA bought the film library of Paramount Pictures in 1959, I believe. Did you work on that deal?
I did not. The fellow who worked on that deal was a guy other than a guy by the name of Wasserman, was a man by the name of Arnold Nemiroff, who one day I got a call that he had died. A wonderful guy who got a heart attack and died probably in his young 40s.
The Department of Justice brought an antitrust action against MCA in 1962, and people were being called to a grand jury. Did you have to appear? Did you work on the case before it was dropped in July of that year?
No, this is the irony. One would think that if one had an employee who had studied under Milton Handler, who anybody that knows what he's talking about knows that Milton Handler is the king of antitrust. You would think that they would recruit them, but nobody ever asked me to get involved. So I was never invited. I had nothing to do with the antitrust case.
Well, describe Review in those early years, apart from its lack of structure.
Review was a very production office, cookie cutter type of operation. And even though nobody could care at this time, as I grew in stature and in responsibility, the reputation of Review grew. And when I left it, it had the best reputation in town as a producer of quality television, at least in my mind.
Can you give an example of a typical show when you arrived and a benchmark show when you
Well, when
moved on?
when I arrived, they had a lot of half-hour westerns like Shotgun Slade and God, Johnny Staccato. The syndication business and the direct sale to advertiser business was a goodly part of their business. And I evolved one day. I really wasn't in the law department very long. I'm not good at reporting to people for the purpose of doing menial, inconsequential work. I don't do that well. But I had grown into a relationship with a man by the name of Walter Hanley, who became kind of a mentor of mine. He had been sent out from New York and was kind of a business affairs type of fellow who was much involved in this, in licensing agreements of programming. What was your question again?
Well,
Who did I report to?